Boom, boom, how's it going? Welcome aboard. It is I, TJ, and today I got a new face, and you're wondering who is this guy? Well, this is Gareth Shepperson, and Gareth Shepperson, I've been in his circle for quite a long time now, learning from him the ropes on how things is done. You can see from his background, my background is full of wallpapers, his background is full of knowledge. And Gareth, how's it going? Welcome aboard.
Great to see you again, TJ.
Awesome stuff. Gareth, who are you and what do you do?
Okay, I'm an attorney and a conveyancer. For those who don't know what a conveyancer is, that's basically an attorney specializing in property law, where we've got additional qualifications. I practice at a law firm called Delport Berg in Pretoria,
Right.
which is a large property firm which is on the panels of most of the banks and does a lot of work with developers and property investors. I'm also the chairman of the property committee of the Pretoria Attorneys Association and on the executive committee, and I'm on the rules board for sectional titles. So I'm vastly experienced in property, but more than that, I'm passionate about property and enjoy all the varying aspects that go with property investment.
Gareth,
Lastly, I'm also have a business where I'm an independent trustee.
Yeah.
And that is relevant to today's topic, I believe.
Awesome. Yeah. And with all these accolades, it is my honor to be hanging out with you. Your time is precious. And I truly appreciate the time that you're giving to us. Now, Gareth, I'm just going to jump into it, right? And the question that I want to ask of you is that a lot of times we go through to seminars, we go through to these schools that are there, and we want to start property. And we all hear these fancy words coming up, and it's for the first time that we are hearing them up. Structures. And all of a sudden, we are now kind of like stuck, and we think, which structure is the right structure for me? And I go out there is 15 of them. I don't know where to start. What's your views?
Okay, TJ, if you will just allow me to start with a quote from Jason Lee. I know you've read his books. I've read his books. He's a well-known property investor and author in South Africa. And he said, the most important aspect of making money out of property is preserving and protecting both the property and the wealth that is created. Far too many property investors rush into buying properties without first getting a suitable property investment structure in place. Without a suitable property investment structure, you are exposed and vulnerable to creditors who can ruthlessly take away everything you have gained. So that, in a nutshell, sums up my thinking as well, is that you need a structure in place that will preserve and protect the property and wealth that you have created. And that you need to set that structure up rather sooner rather than later, so that you're protecting those assets that you're building from the very beginning. There's obviously a valid reason for this, in that if you invest in your own name, which we definitely do not recommend. In fact, the only time you should ever consider even buying property in your own name is your private residence, because there is a small capital gains tax. Well, there's a significant capital gains tax advantage, but most people don't go around selling their houses too often, but the ones that they live in. So if you're an investor and not worried about your and not dealing with your primary residence, you should never invest in your own name. And if you do so, and you later want to transfer it into the structure, there's a huge number of costs that can be involved in that. Things like transfer duty, deemed interest charges, donations tax, capital gains tax. So there's a lot of costs and in fact the costs that you're going to have to pay the conveyancer to do those transfers as well. So there's a lot of costs that are involved in trying to rectify your structure at a later stage, and that's why we always say, get it right from the beginning, and you will be very thankful later on that you've done so, because there's then no further costs to securing your assets in a proper structure.
Right. I think, Gareth, I think there's two things there that I want to latch on there in terms of what you've just mentioned now. There's the idea of starting off, and we start off, and because we don't know what we don't know, we just start. A lot of us, we already had 2 to 3, 4 properties by the time that we went into some form of education. And I actually want us maybe to have that as a topic. So in terms of, you are where you are now, maybe you've got 5, maybe you've got 3. You're thinking that they're investments, properties, and yet they're in your name. How can you resolve that? I think that's a topic on its own. But today, I think maybe where we can focus on is, I am just listening in for the first time. I now want to go into property investments. What are the investments? What are the structures that are there in my disposal to protect my assets, so that we can walk on the same path that Jason is talking about here?
Okay, there basically, let's say 2.5. I call closed corporations are half a structure, because you can't register new closed corporations anymore. They're busy being phased out, but some people still have them. So it is a structure that can be used, and everything that I'm going to say about companies, in other words, PTY limited companies, would apply to closed corporations. But I'm not going to mention them again, because they basically are being phased out. I only mention it now because some people may still have them.
Sure.
Therefore, there are actually 2 main ones: trusts and companies.
Right.
Now, if we interrogate the 2 of them, if we look at trusts, trusts are a great method of protecting your wealth and securing your legacy for the future. All your assets should be in some form of trust. So even later on, when I get to a company, you should put your shares of the company into your own personal trust, because that way you can preserve your legacy for the future. Well, firstly, trusts also, they create a possibility actually that you can create a bigger portfolio and a better portfolio than merely investing in your own name. But they're more suited to passive holding type investments. If you're doing a lot of transactions, flipping property and so on, they're not really the most suited, and they're also not suited to where you have different number of investors. So if you've got, let's say, 5 different investors who pull together their money and decide they're going to invest in a property, it doesn't make sense to do it in a trust. A trust is not a very flexible instrument, and the problem is, with 5 different people, there are 5 different views on how the business should be managed, what the desired outcomes are, what the timelines are, when certain people want to exit, how much each one must contribute in that. And because a trust is not such a flexible instrument, it is better to, in such cases, to rather have it in a company. A trust is still nevertheless way better than having it in your personal name, and it can be suited to, for example, where it's a family business and basically you're just securing the assets for your kids. But again, it's not as flexible, and I wouldn't really look at it. I would look at it to hold your properties in, but to hold your shares of a company that own properties in, but I wouldn't hold the properties directly in it. I mean, if you go, I'm sure lots of people here who are going to watch this video have been to presentations on trusts and so on, and I think many people will be familiar with the so-called double trust structure. The double trust structure basically entails...
What is double trust structures, Gareth?
The double trust structure seems to have emerged somewhere around the 1990s, and I know there are various people who have claimed to have originated it. In my personal opinion, it comes from a guy called Peter Carruthers in a book called Crash Proof Your Business. But be that as it may, whoever originated it, it is now widely accepted within all people who are advising on trusts. And that involves that you have a family trust where all your most secure assets are held. And then you have an investment trust. People call it different names, a share trust or whatever you want to call it. And in that one is where you take a bit more risks. And basically, I have never heard of a case where a beneficiary of a trust has been held liable for the debts of a trust. So since the beneficiary of the trading trust or the share trust is your family trust, it is unlikely that your family trust can ever be held liable for the activities or the debts of the trading or share trust. Right. So in that way, your assets, once you have transferred them to your family trust, are 100% protected. A lot of people say they're 99% protected, but since I've never heard of a case where a creditor has successfully pursued a beneficiary of a trust, other than fraud and things like that, which we won't talk about. But I've never heard of such a case, and therefore I can only say it's 100% protection, and your assets are 100% creditor proof once they're in your family trust. So that's basically the idea of the double trust structure.
Okay. So Gareth, whilst we're at that, I want to bring you back to, and I want to introduce here Thabo and Mary. They're happily married, young, and they've gone through to one of these training sessions and things like that. They've heard that they need to have structures and things like that. So we've mentioned that there is trust here. We've mentioned that there is companies, various types of companies, CC, PTYs, and things like that. And the question that you go on to talk about the trust, and it almost sounds like the trust is really to protect your assets for the future generations that are going to come along after you have gone. And I want to tell you, Gareth, when I started doing property, it was not about my kids, or even like the kids that are going to come. I wasn't thinking that far, I have to confess, right? But now that I'm in it in a few years, the thoughts are coming in, and I'm now thinking, how can I protect it? So to Thabo and Mary, who were also in my position they just want to get started and put a little bit of money so that there is beacon, and maybe they can do a trip to Durban once in a while, and hopefully go to America one day with their business of the property. What is the baby step which you think that maybe they should be going into? Because we've spoken about a few things here.
Okay. Well, firstly, I hope Thabo loves Mary and Mary loves Thabo, because in that case, whether they have kids, don't have kids, whatever the situation is, at the very least, they want to ensure that their spouse does not suffer the consequences of them not structuring their investment property. For example, did you know that on your death, your estate can lose up to 55% of its value in fees and taxes? However, and that your heirs are going to have to pay that. So Mary's going to have to pay for Thabo's taxes and fees, or vice versa. But
I don't think a lot of us, we know that.
And even worse, if both were to pass away and they did have kids, the kids would be saddled with that debt. Now, if your Thabo and Mary have got two investment properties but don't have much cash,
right?
All the fees and taxes and so on that are payable will be calculated on the value of those properties. Let's say each of those properties is worth a couple of the total value of the property is worth a couple of million. The taxes could be quite significant, and the kids are going to have to come up with it. Or alternatively, if there's no kids, the surviving spouse is going to have to come up with that money. And in addition, the person who's passed away's bank account is going to be frozen until the estate is finalized. So if you have everything in a trust, the trust continues. A trust has perpetual succession. It never ends until eventually you close it down, or the trustees close it down. So when you die, things just carry on. Your tenants keep paying in their rent to your account, and things carry on. Your kids can access those funds. The trustees can pay those funds to your kids. Your kids' school fees and everything will be taken care of. If it's only Thabo and Mary, she can pay for petrol for a car, or he can pay for his insurance, or whatever the case may be. Things just continue. So that is why it's important from a succession point of view to do that. But also, even if you then don't think you're going to die anytime soon. I know young people tend to think they're immortal and will live forever, but
well, with COVID around, it doesn't look like it anymore.
Yeah, look, so even if you're young or young at heart and think you're not going to die anytime soon, and you're not worried about things like this, or I suppose if you're unmarried and you've got no worry about leaving people in difficulty when you leave this earth, then there are other things to consider. And I know we've discussed this on a couple of occasions. When we talk structure, the first thing is most people jump into immediately is, what's the tax? What's the tax consequences? What's the difference between putting a property in my own name, doing it in a trust, or doing it in a company? And all of those entities or individuals are taxed differently. So there are different tax advantages and disadvantages for whichever entity you may choose.
Right.
However, again, I would say that the savings in capital gains tax and everything on your death must also be considered when considering the current tax. But in your example of Tabu and Mary, let's say they are only worried about the current tax and not worried about the future implications of that tax. With trusts, there's a principle called the conduit principle, and we don't have time, I don't think, to go into it now. It basically means that you can allocate certain of the income to the beneficiaries within a trust, and whoever is taxed on the lowest tax rate, and thereby pay the lowest tax possible. So though in theory a trust pays 45% tax, if you manage your trust properly and apply the conduit principle, you can reduce that tax to very low amounts. So if we look from a tax point of view, trusts are often vilified by people and say they're very tax inefficient. 45% tax, extremely high. Yeah, that is true if you don't manage it properly. If we look at companies,
so
companies are taxed.
It's in context on versus how you're operating the
Yes.
trustee itself, what you're doing within that trust.
Yes.
So it's not just a willy-nilly global or blanket statement that you can say, because you might have a trust for 5-10 years and never have to pay the 45% because you didn't do something that attracts the 45%.
Yes. Yes. So, but any income would be at that rate if you didn't manage it properly. And the same actually applies whether it's a trust or a company. If you don't manage it effectively, that's only marginally better than owning it in your own name. For example, with a trust, the courts have identified what they call sham trusts, which is basically people carrying on and operating their assets as if they are their own and not treating them as trust property. So they don't keep proper records of AGMs, have financials drawn up, have an independent trustee, which is very important, and distance themselves from their assets. Yes, they can enjoy the benefits of their assets 100%, but the actual management and dealing with the assets needs to be separated from the individual when you create a structure, so that the courts will, and the most importantly, I suppose, SARS, won't treat it as your own personal income or your own personal assets. So yeah, it's important that we realize that merely registering companies and trusts and so on and so forth is only the first step. You actually got to then take it further and ensure that you do it. And the conduit principle is a great example of if you don't manage it properly, how you can lose large amounts due to tax.
I generally say,
I was going to say also for companies, if you look at a company, it's typically taxed at 28%, but also when the person is taking out dividends, it may also cost another 20%. So you're looking, you could be looking at a similar sort of tax for a company as you are looking at for a trust. If you're looking at an individual, if you have the members of your family as beneficiaries of your trust, and you apply the conduit principle, your tax rate could be like 20%. It could be pretty low, even though your personal income tax rate might be at the maximum 45%. So yeah, each it's horses for courses. Each individual and their investment strategy will decide on the structure that is best suited to them.
What are the baby steps for Thabo and Mary to do? So now they want to go into property. They've just maybe potentially listened to this, and they're thinking company, and they're thinking which kind of a company. They've met someone else, and Johannes have said, hey, I actually have a close corporation that I can sell to you guys. It's a 1978. And Thabo and Mary are now having an intense fellowship at home in terms of which structures to start with. And at the risk of them starting, they've been deadlocked for the last 2 years now, Gareth, in terms of the right structure. They're not getting, the one is hearing other things from other people. And this is actually a real life story that, I come across from time to time. People telling me that they're not starting because they don't have the right structure. And I said, but we were together in the class 5 years ago, and how come you haven't started? And he said, no, I'm still looking I need the right structure first. What is the baby steps? What is the channel of Thabo and Mary to do together as husband and wife?
Okay, well, the first baby step is to do something. Even a wrong step in the direction of putting your assets into a trust or a company is better than doing nothing.
Sure.
So resolve together that you're going to make a decision one way or another. And then far be it from me to say it's my way or the highway and that I know better than any of these other advisors out there. As I've just mentioned, each case is different, and you would have to look at each one individually to decide on the way forward. The way that I generally recommend is that if you're going to invest in property, whether it's buy-to-let or flipping of property, is that the investments be held in a company. That is the way that we recommend. Then, for all the reasons that I mentioned above about retaining the benefits of a trust, you would put the shares of that company into the trust. And so that is the structure that we recommend. We sometimes, depending on the risk profile, if it's a high risk profile, we sometimes would then insert that double trust structure that we mentioned earlier, so that you would have your family trust, your share trust, and you would put the shares of your company or companies into the trust. Because you must remember, what is the purpose of the whole thing when looking for asset protection? It's to compartmentalize your risk. So you're putting your risk into different compartments. So if you've got 10 million rands worth of risk and you put 1 million into each different company, and a creditor comes and attacks that company, what is your exposure? Your exposure is 1 million rand. They can take that company, but if the other companies haven't signed surety or anything like that, then you are in the fortunate position. Well, I say fortunate. It's not that really fortunate to lose 1 million rand. You're fortunate to have a 10 million rand portfolio in the first place. But if you lose 1 million, it's better than losing 10 million. So if you lose everything you have built up over the years, say you've spent 10, 20 years building up this portfolio, the whole stack of cards can come tumbling down in one go. I know sometimes you see in the shopping centers where you don't see it much lately, but when I was younger, you used to see these people stack these dominoes in a long thing through the shopping center.
Yes. And then I've seen a couple of videos of those.
You knock the first one over and then all goes all over the place. And that's the last thing you want for your property structure is that one domino knocks down everything. Right. So whatever people do, move it off your own name into a structure. And once your business grows or whatever, and you have other additional properties that you're adding, put it into another compartment, so another company. Keep that different, because especially those people who are looking to do property development, every property development should be in its own company. There is no ways you should run up different property developments out of the same company, or even worse, put your property development in the same company where you've already got a successful buy-to-let portfolio. Your successful buy-to-let portfolio is your cash cow. You don't want to put that at risk by putting a development in there, because developments are far more risky than a buy to let. Rather put the development on its own. If it fails, it fails. Whatever you've put in, you lose. But your future, your retirement policy, your cash cow, whatever you want to call it, in your buy to let portfolio is still available there. And similarly, I would not put flip properties. I wouldn't flip properties out of the same entity where I'm got a successful buy to let portfolio, because even though you do your homework and you make sure as far as you can that the property you're going to flip is going to be a success, anything can happen. There could be an earthquake and the property is swallowed or something, and your insurance somehow lapsed, and therefore your 2 million rand house has fallen into a sinkhole, and the land is now worth 100,000. So you've lost 1.9 million.
Yeah.
You don't want that impacting on your other businesses.
Whilst you're saying that, Gareth, I remember I think maybe about 2.5 years ago, I remember you were having a chat, or should I say you at a conference where I attended, and you had a slot, and you were talking about exactly what you're talking about today. And at the time, my business hadn't grown to where it is now, and there was nothing to compartmentalize. And we call it ring fencing in our team. And about 1.5 years ago, I brought up the same conversations with my team, and I said, guys, you know what? We're building a business, but everything is in one company. How do we de-risk ourselves? And for us, taking on your opinion there, we actually went on to say, okay, fine, our business is into 3 things. So the first one is that we do student accommodation, and the risk associated with student accommodation is very different from our buy-to-let properties, because obviously if you have students on a property, they behave very differently. So we ring-fence.
I vaguely remember that.
Yes, and we ring-fence that. And we have actually gone out to insurance companies, and we have said, these are the things that might happen at our property, because you have these kids here, first years, they might not even know how to turn on a stove. You know what I mean? So it's very high. And we have separated that business from our normal business, which is buy-to-let. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation again, because some of these things, as we talk about them now, they don't resonate because you are not there yet. But by the time you are there and you are feeding yourselves with such kind of information, it comes back, and hopefully you can act upon it. And that's the dream of all of these conversations that we are always having here. Gareth, as we come to an end on this conversation here, I want to ask of you to say, if, I know you did say it a little bit earlier on at the beginning of the conversation, but I want to highlight it. I'll kind of like just, put it out there. There I am. I have journeyed in my journey in the last 10 years, and I've bought all my properties in my personal capacity, because that's the one thing I can say that I have taken out of my conversation with you today. Do not buy in your personal name for property investments. What has been your worst case scenario of an individual who bought 10 years, X amount of properties, and now Jesus said, come home?
Well, we've had several. I don't work directly in the estates division, but I have heard the horror stories as well of people who have basically had to sell large numbers of their properties. And as a buyer of distressed property yourself, TJ, I'm sure that you know that quite often the distressed properties are from estates. Yes, there are people who have lost their job or become insolvent or whatever, and those properties become distressed. But I actually think the largest pool of distressed properties come from estates. And it's for precisely that reason, is that because you've built up your 10 properties that you're renting out, but you've got zero cash on hand. So when the time comes to transfer those properties to the heirs, pay the capital gains tax on those properties and so on, and the heirs have to pay that, there's no cash in the estate. So what happens? The executor of the estate has to urgently try and sell those properties in order to pay those taxes. And what is the end result normally is that those properties are sold at significantly below market value. If the properties had been in a trust or something, none of those taxes would be payable. And if the heirs don't want those properties, they can sell those properties in their own time, because those properties are then not distressed. Those properties are then can be sold at market value, and the heirs will ultimately benefit by selling at a higher value.
So there is Mary and Thabo thinking that, you know, they're building something great here, but then Mary goes and sees Jesus, and she's thinking that she's actually worked very hard with her spouse Thabo, but actually she's left more problems for Thabo.
Yep, and I know we've talked a lot about deceased estates here, but there's also insolvency. Insolvency is also a consideration. If the spouses are married in community of property, that's bad, because they're going to lose everything. Even if they're married out of community of property, it creates a very difficult situation when there's insolvency. And even if it doesn't go as far as insolvency, but that there are bank repossessions of properties or judgments where other creditors come after your property, all of those, the exact same thing would apply with regard to protection as it would with a deceased estate. So it's not only when someone dies, it's also under all of those difficult circumstances.
My recommendation, ladies and gentlemen, is that if you're wanting to start off, I'm of the view that this is my personal view, the first thing that you want to do, not go and Google and all of those things, because they're just going to lead you astray. Yes, get the information, but go and sit with someone like Gareth, right? Because if you are to sit with someone like Gareth, then they can show you the world of what is the possibility. Gareth, you've been you've been a law expert for the last, what, 20 years?
Yep, longer than that, I'm afraid.
And you have seen the good and the bad. And with that, it's no longer just textbook. It is real life examples, what you have preserved and what you can now do. Laws changes from time to time. Google doesn't know that, right? So you need to speak to a warm body, and Gareth is that person. Gareth, where can they get a hold of you? I think we can jump into the links below, and you'll get all of Gareth's details. And Gareth, in closing comments on this, I know we're going to have many chat conversations, because there's just a lot here to talk about around law and getting started. But getting started alone, what's your closing comments in here?
My closing comments is, yes, preferably go and see an expert and chat to someone about it and learn what you can. But then please do something. Don't just sit back and do nothing. Even if you decide you're going to register your own company and that you can register it for a couple of $100 through CRPC, or it's better than doing nothing. So my closing thought is, do something.
Awesome stuff. Now you know why I hang out with Gareth, because we are doers, not just information junkies. Do something. Cheers. We'll check you out on the next video.